Okay, guys, have a seat. Have a seat. We're going to get started now. Before I start, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Dr. Thomas Grund. I'm based at the School of Sociology. You've seen a couple of other of my colleagues of mine before, and I have the pleasure to talk to you today about globalization. And before I start this, let me mention what I do with all my lectures. Actually, I video record all my lectures, so I'm going to make this lecture capturing available to you afterwards. Yeah? So you're going to get access to that. And also all the lecture slides and things like that. Okay, so let's get started with globalization. This is basically what I brought with me today. These are the different things that I want to talk with you about. First, I want to talk about globalization in general. What do we mean by that? Why is it on the rise? Where is it actually going? Then I want to have a brief detour to the historical context of that. Is globalization a new thing? Or was it there already before? Or is it nowadays a qualitatively different thing? After that, I want to talk to you about four main drivers of globalization nowadays. Globalization, especially in the 21st century, of the last 10, 15 years. Like four origins that kind of lead to that. And then I want to get started a discussion and also involve you, so there's going to be some activity with you guys as well about pros and cons about globalization. So I want you to start thinking about that. I also brought something about Ireland. I thought, after all, we are in Ireland, so let's see. And we are affected by globalization, actually quite a large degree. Actually, Ireland last year counted as the most globalized country in the world. I think this year, the similar statistics rank it as the second most globalized country in the world. But, first or second, who cares? It's bloody globalized. Or even myself, look at me. I'm not an Irish, I'm a German. I lived in 7 different countries in the last 15 years. And that's just an example of a normal life nowadays in academia. And last but not least, I brought 2 other challenges that I would love to have complete lectures about. Yeah? But, here we're talking about them in the context of globalization. Because they are sort of like coming out of that. They are sort of implications of globalizations, and I think we should talk about them. Okay, so that's basically the program for today. So let me get started with what I call globalization on the rise. What is globalization? Let me first throw a definition out there. Globalization, we can define it as the process by which the world is becoming increasingly interconnected as a result of massively increased trade and cultural exchange. So I thought about how can I convey to you the degree of that. How can I bring that message across to you in what kind of globalized world we're living in? So actually, before I came here, I kind of got a coffee just around the corner. I talked with the people there, and I asked them, so where's this bean coming from? Well, apparently this is an Ethiopian roast. So my coffee has been in Ethiopia, and now it's here. Another thing that you might not know, like these coffee lids, somehow mine is broken. Yeah. But these coffee lids, apparently there's a Finnish company called Huhtamaki. They are the global leader in producing those stupid lids. Like almost all lids in the world that you encounter are produced by Huhtamaki. Once you kind of start looking at that, you kind of realize, whoa. So Ethiopia, Finland, actually my leather jacket comes from India. Yeah. The jumper that I'm currently wearing was produced in Cambodia. The t-shirt that I wear underneath it comes from New Zealand. Some sheep in New Zealand, probably that is why it was so expensive. My underwear comes from Bangladesh. My jeans from Pakistan. And I'm wearing these Nike shoes. They were produced in Vietnam. And I didn't deliberately choose those clothes today. It was just a normal day. Not just a normal day. I have my phone here. It's a Motorola phone. Actually, I quite like it. It's a nice phone. It used to be an American company. Now it's actually owned by Lenovo. It's a Chinese company. And actually, this phone was mostly produced in China. Actually, this phone was produced in a company called Pegatron. I'm going to have a video about that later on a little bit. But hang on. Is this phone completely Chinese? Oh, not really, actually. Actually, the glass on the front of it, it's kind of Corning glass that's being produced in the United States. components of the display often come from Germany. The processors in this phone, some of them come from Taiwan, others come from Singapore, and so on and so forth. Actually, I was thinking, do I have anything Irish with me? And actually, I found something. Finally, my German headphones, the Sennheiser headphones, nice headphones, good quality headphones. Finally, Sennheiser produces these headphones in Tullamore. And that's just a random example. I don't know, if you start looking at where does your stuff come from, I bet you encountered exactly the same things. And that's sort of like just one aspect of how globalization works these days. When you look at national companies, here there's some examples about Nike, Levi's, and H&M. Like they have companies, they have factories all over the world. They produce all over the world. And nowadays it's becoming almost like standard that a company has a headquarter in one country. They kind of design it in another country. They have it produced in another country and they sell it in yet another country. That's just how it is nowadays. That's just how it goes. So, and actually I brought a little video with me here. So now this is sort of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And there they talk a little bit about that as well. So let me play that video for you.
Trade is the engine of the global economy. More people, more goods, and more services are crossing borders today than ever before. But trade has changed dramatically in the 21st century. Through much of history, a good produced in a country was largely made of parts sourced there. Today, products are composed of parts from all over the world. To fully understand trade, we have to measure the value added at each point in the process. Imagine China exports a $100 smartphone to the United States. China may have only produced $10 or $20 of the total value of that phone. The rest of it was imported from elsewhere. Graphic design from a California studio, computer code from programmers in France, a silicon chip from a factory in Singapore, precious metals mined in Bolivia. Trade improves competitiveness. Cheaper imports of parts and cheaper access to services bring benefits to consumers and companies alike. To realize the full potential, we need seamless border crossings, simpler customs procedures, sophisticated logistics, and more trade liberalization, especially in services.
Okay, so that is what the OECD makes us believe or wants us to know what we need to have for globalization, but it also captures like the degree of actually the globalized world that we are living in. And let me first talk about two other definitions here, because then only we can understand certain graphs that I want to show you to grasp the magnitude of this globalization. First of all, it was already mentioned trade or international trade. We can define that as the exchange of capital, goods, and services across international borders, our territories, and it's the exchange of these goods and services among nations of the world. And oftentimes that is sort of measured as a share of the gross domestic product. So it's basically a certain amount of trade that is being made, that is valued at a certain amount of money, right? And you can benchmark that against the total amount of money that is being generated in a country, in a nation. That's sort of what we call the gross domestic product. So there I have the definition next to it. The gross domestic product measures the monetary value of final goods and services, those bought by final users, produced in a country in a given period of time. When you look at how do certain countries fare economically, most often they use a measure of the GDP, of the gross domestic product. Sometimes it can be adjusted for inflation, sometimes it's adjusted for some other things and so on. But that's sort of like the basic idea, right? So we have trade and we have the gross domestic product. And now I'm going to show you a graph and how these two things developed over the last, actually in this case, like 35 years. So this is a graph starting in 1980. The way you read that is that whatever the trade was in 1980, that was 100, right? So if it sort of goes up to 200, that means it doubled, right? If it goes, in this case, it goes up to 800, that means it's multiplied by a factor of 8. So there's 8 times as much trade nowadays than there was in the 1980s. And when you look at the graph for the GDP, you can see that this international trade grew proportionally larger than the GDP. And so it's not just an expansion of the GDP, but more of the GDP is coming out of this trade. And actually, people say that sometimes it's related, these are highly correlated, which is why sort of some certain countries, they are so avid about kind of looking at their trade balance, and they want to encourage trade. And there's a whole discussion we'll talk about later about tearing down trade boundaries. And there's a whole lot of problems that come into play, especially when you talk about Ireland, and suddenly the UK is leaving the European Union. And we have a whole lot of trade problems. Because what it does at the end is going to dramatically affect the GDP in Ireland. Because these things are highly, highly correlated. Yeah? A lot of the jobs here actually depend on goods. Because, I don't know, in Ireland, these headphones are being sold to the European Union, apparently produced from a German company in Tullamore. And then you're going to have tariffs, you're going to have taxes and these kind of things. But we'll talk more about that later on. So when we talk about globalization, and the term itself, I think, was first used in the 1980s in the Harvard Business Review, and it's mostly been used in the context of economic globalization. Yeah, that's sort of like trade. That's sort of often what we mean with that, or this is where it comes from. But by now, globalization has a whole lot of other dimensions to it as well. You know, there's a cultural and there's a social component to it, which is very, very pronounced as well. So in social terms, what does globalization mean? Well, here it describes an increased level of interconnectedness among the people of the world and their lives, works, and families. And in this case, I just had to think about my own life, or you can think about your life, the people that you know who live abroad, or the travels that you had, how I'm connected with my family back home. Finally, my mom figured out how Skype works, or how WhatsApp goes. She still sends me strange emojis, but this is very strongly connected here. Yeah. I went through 7 countries in the last 15 years, and that's normal for an academic nowadays. Yeah? In many jobs, that's actually how it is. You apply for jobs in the world. You apply for jobs in Europe, outside of Ireland. And as a cultural phenomenon, we also observe that. As a cultural phenomenon, it means that the exchange of ideas, it refers to the exchange of ideas and values among cultures, and applies for some a trend toward the development of a single world culture. What do I mean by that? Well, Hollywood movies, for example. These things are being transmitted and being watched all over the world. The same kind of pop music, we listen to it all over the world. Right nowadays, it's almost like an instant global chart on my Spotify list. Yeah? What do people listen to in the United States right now? Yeah? And these things are being recommended to me and so on and so forth. So by now, basically to sum that up, it's not just about an economic dimension to it anymore, although that kind of plays a huge, huge part in that. It's sort of like the big driver behind that. But in line with that, we nowadays have social and cultural globalization as well. So what does this lead to? Well, it leads to a massive increase in international trade. Companies are not operating in one single country anymore. There's a much larger dependence on the global economy. Look at us in Ireland. We're freaking out about Brexit because we're going to be affected by it. Yeah? We're looking at how the European Union does. We look at how the world economy does because we are affected by it. So these things are much, much tightly linked with each other, and much more so than only 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Okay, let me paddle back a little bit, and now as we talk a little bit about globalization, let me put that in an historical context. Because you might say, hang on, there was globalization for a long time already. And you're right. There was international trade. There was the Silk Road, that connected China or the Far East to Europe. There was, at various times in human history, there was sort of like international travel and exchange. But now the question is that sort of what we observe nowadays of a qualitatively different kind? So what I'm going to do now I'm going to show you a graph which takes these two figures that I just introduced, the trade and the GDP, and the share of the trade on the GDP. It's basically how much of a country's economy stems from trade. And you see that over the last 500 years. So what you see here now is that, well, actually there was quite a bit of globalization in the beginning of the 20th century already. The two world wars didn't help here. They kind of actually, and then there was like a protectionist view in some countries. But then after that, it increased dramatically again, and especially over the last 10, 15 years. So now actually over half of a country's GDP comes from trade, international trade. So that's sort of crazy. So I have another video with me about the question: is this a different kind of globalization that we observe nowadays? Or is this of different quality? So let's watch this video.
If you think about it historically, most things didn't travel very far from their point of origin. Most people didn't travel very far from where they were born. Most products were made locally. A lot of information remained local. And what we see now is that a lot of these things have become more mobile. People traveling the world, goods being made wherever it's most efficient, information traveling instantaneously around the globe. And it's gotten us to the point where so many things are born global. There used to be a time when companies could start in one place and conquer a local market and hone their skills. And at one point, you would take the decision: we're going to expand internationally, and let's go to this market, let's go to that market. And increasingly, you're born global. Your products are available in many parts of the world. It's a tremendous opportunity for a lot of companies to get scale fairly quickly. But of course, it also poses lots of challenges. One thing that has certainly changed is there are hardly any parts of the world that aren't connected and that aren't plugged in, right? For a long time when we talked about globalization, it was really, some of the large emerging markets from Asia becoming connected into the global economy. But now all of Africa is connected. Most Latin American countries have integrated into the global economy. You look at the history of globalization and the cost of moving things, physical objects, people, and information has fallen dramatically. But especially over the last 10 to 15 years, you're literally talking about the cost coming down to zero when it comes to information. So our ability to digitize things, not just communications, but even products and services, has dramatically increased. And the price of transmitting that has come down to zero. And sometimes you say, well, is this just a quantitative change or is it a qualitative change? But when you have the cost of global reach approaching zero for a whole lot of things, that is a qualitative change.
Okay, so now another thing that we actually observe nowadays is that, well, the speaker mentioned it a little bit, it's not just that the less developed country exports goods to the developed country anymore. Especially during the last 5 to 10 years, we see much more South-South trade. So they're sort of like in the same degree exchange between countries in Africa and Asia, or between countries in South America and Asia. So it's not just going into this one direction anymore, which is sort of how historically it used to be, especially during the times of colonialism as well. But nowadays, this is sort of like a different quality that we observe. So just by sheer numbers, but also in terms of the quality of what it actually includes. Okay, so next I want to move on and I want to talk to you about, okay, where does this globalization come from? What are the factors that kind of made that possible? Or what are the factors that kind of are responsible for that, especially in the last 10 to 15 years? So one factor that was already mentioned before, it's the improvements in transportation. So nowadays, large cargo ships, they mean that the cost of transporting goods between countries has dramatically decreased, and there are economies of scale. There are these massive, massive tankers on the world and cargo ships that kind of make it incredibly easy to ship goods around. As an example, the largest ship in the world, container ship in the world, can hold around 20,000 containers. Does anybody know how big such a container is? It's 15 meters to 3 meters by 3 meters. So we're talking about 20,000 times 15 meters. So if you line that up, all those containers in one line, that's 300 kilometers. One ship. 300 kilometers. If you live in the mileage world, I don't know, this is around 200 miles, a little less than 200 miles. one container ship. So what does it mean? So these ships become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you hear it in the news about extensions of the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal and so on to accommodate those massive, massive freighters and so on. One consequence of that is actually that the cost per unit has dropped dramatically. Yeah, and this is sort of what you see over here. So now from the 1930s onwards, again, now 1930 stands for 100%, and now you see where we are right now. So, and this is now data from 2005, and I don't know, I'm sure it actually went down even more. We were just about 20% of the cost of 1930. Or the other figures for transporting passengers via air travel, that has gone down. You must remember, I don't know, I remember the arrival of Ryanair. Suddenly things became really cheap. Yeah? And air travel is incredibly cheap. Actually, I've been traveling to Manchester last year. I paid more for the bloody bus to get to the airport than to fly from Dublin to Manchester. Yeah. Or international calling costs. If you're like me and if you're an international person, you're so hyped that from this year onwards, there are no roaming charges in Europe anymore. Right? So I've been traveling all over Europe this summer, and I had my unlimited internet with me. Okay. So these costs have declined tremendously. While at the same time, the quantity of information, the quantity of goods that is going around has increased massively. So what I have now, and I have a little video that shows you actually those ships. I remember I told you about this 300-kilometer long line of cargo, of these containers. These dots on this map, each dot represent one ship. Yeah? Each dot represents one ship, and now play this little video about these international trade routes.
At any given moment, tens of thousands of giant cargo ships are moving around the world's oceans. These ships, some of which are more than a quarter of a mile long, are the heavy lifters of the global economy, shifting everything from metal ores and compressed gas to fresh fruit and plastic toys. This interactive map shows the movements of the world's commercial shipping fleet in 2012, based on hundreds of millions of individually recorded positions. Plotting all the raw positions at once shows the extraordinary extent of modern shipping's reach. Even without a background map, the world's coastlines are clearly defined, albeit with plenty of variation, from the buzz of activity in the East China Sea to the relative quiet of Somalia's piracy-afflicted waters. While ships can move freely through the open ocean, routes are predetermined closer to land, and especially in tight straits such as the dual carriageway of the English Channel. The most crucial shipping thoroughfares of all, though, are the man-made canals linking different bodies of water, such as the Panama Canal, opened a century ago to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and the even older and busier Suez Canal, which saw 17,000 transits in 2012 alone. In some places, ships penetrate deep into continents via rivers and lakes, such as the massive Paraguay and Amazon rivers in South America, or the Great Lakes in North America, whose ports include Chicago, Milwaukee, and Toronto. Colouring the ships by category shows the flows of the global economy in more detail. The red dots are the tankers, which shunt oil from massive terminals in the Middle East or from offshore rigs in West Africa and elsewhere, while the blue dots are so-called dry bulk ships, which move aggregates, ores and coal from mines and quarries, many of them found in Australia and Latin America. Many of these raw materials are shipped to manufacturing regions to make finished goods that are themselves then moved back across the ocean in container ships, shown here in yellow. China is the centre of the shipping container world. Shanghai alone moved 33 million units in 2012. While all of this shipping makes modern life as we know it possible, there is a downside. Moving billions of tons of ships and cargo relies on burning massive quantities of bunker fuel. The result is a huge amount of carbon dioxide, or CO2, the main driver of global warming. Commercial ships produce more than 1 million tons of CO2 every day, more than the whole of the UK, or Canada, or Brazil. Click around the map to explore the data for yourself, or click the info sign for more information about how it was made.
So it's actually a cool map, so you can check it out. I can recommend it, shipmap.org. You can play around with that a little more. But just the sheer quantity of that kind of stuff, that's like really, really astonishing. And also how this increased over the last few years. So there you see actually now a graph that shows you the increase since 2000, in the last 17 years. And when we look at China, for example, it increased by over 340%. So if you start by zero, you increase by 100%, you double. So basically now they sort of like more than quadrupled. The container traffic from China more than quadrupled in the last 15 years. Or even in Europe, it more than doubled. It increased by 123%. So there's like a massive thing going on here. If you wonder where actually these phones come from, why sort of my clothes from Cambodia are probably so cheap, because transport costs nowadays are just so cheap because of these economies of scale. Because we have these massive container ships going around. So that's just one of the driving factors. Yeah? Just one of the driving factors. Another one you might have heard about or came across about, is in the news once in a while, are trade agreements. And maybe you came across TTIP, or there's sort of like other versions of that. Maybe you heard about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Or actually the biggest one, or for us the most relevant of all, is actually the European Union. Yeah? We're living in a single market in the European Union, meaning that goods and services and capital can travel freely. That means there are no tariffs and no taxes being paid when you produce a good in Ireland and you sell it in Northern Ireland, or you have it processed over there and shipped back and so on. There used to be borders, and there used to be taxes, and countries used to protect themselves from cheap products from the rest of the world, right? And if you kind of go back into that, so the World Trade Organization, just to say a word about that, it's actually not that old. It was sort of founded in 1994. So a bit more than 20 years ago. Before, there used to be some agreements. There was something called GATT, but then it was being replaced by the World Trade Organization, which suddenly formed this umbrella and this created this framework for all those trade agreements between different countries in the world. Yeah. And with trade agreement, we mean these things like setting a legal framework for how goods are being exchanged and lowering the barriers for that. Yeah. And that's one of those things, back in the 80s, a lot of the products in the States, all of those consumer products, they were still produced in the United States. Now they're all produced in China. Yeah. And you can imagine that at the time, people were very cautious about this whole development, like tearing down those walls, right? Because it obviously threatens local jobs and things like that. At the same time, it also creates other opportunities. But anyway, so we see a massive increase in these trade agreements that govern the relationship between different countries. And now I just want to look you at the right-hand side, at the right-hand graph, that shows you the number of trade agreements between different countries. And you see how that exploded since the 1990s. Actually, since the World Trade Organization was founded and came into existence and provided that framework for that, now we don't just have the European Union. We have, maybe you heard about NAFTA, this North American Free Trade Organization. There's sort of like versions of that all over the world. There's one for South America, there's one for the Arabic countries, there's one for Southeast Asia, there's one for certain countries only, and so on and so forth. Yeah? But there's a massive increase in trade agreements that lower the boundaries for people to move goods freely around and from one country to another. A third factor that I want to talk about quickly here is improvement of communications. I don't have to tell you, this kind of stuff that completely changed our life. I don't know, nowadays we can't even imagine a world without that anymore. I don't know what you did on Monday, but I didn't freak out about my power. I freaked about my mobile broadband. Yeah? So that completely changed our lives to a degree that most of you don't even grasp because you only grew up in that period. But things like WhatsApp didn't exist like 10 years ago. Or I don't know, not even 5 years, maybe 5 years ago, I don't know. Yeah? So it's a tremendous change. Or I don't know, another aspect that you might know, maybe some of you are involved in that. You play with online games, you play with people all over the world. But it's not only that, I don't know, suddenly now I'm on WhatsApp with my mom. Now she gets hold of me and kind of tells me jokes and that sends me emojis that I don't want to get. But it's not only there. Nowadays, production or even agriculture is incredibly connected. Why do they do that? Well, actually, a farmer looks up the global market price for whether or not it's a good time to harvest. There's a farmer in Vietnam that looks up, should I sell my rice today for which kind of price? And they look up the global market at that particular day. So it's incredibly connected in that sense, but even more so, I talked a little bit earlier about this phone. No, probably it was designed in the United States. Then all those specifications are being sent to a company that has nothing to do with Motorola, yeah? And that company produces that, sends it back, or in the case of clothing, that's sort of how it works. There's some designers in Sweden that probably designed my jumper, yeah? And then they send the specifications instantaneously over to Cambodia, where these things are being automatically cut and whatnot, and a week later, the container ship arrives, and I buy my jumper in Ireland. So we cannot underestimate the effect that the internet or better possibilities for communication has changed our lives, and how it has changed the setup for trade and kind of triggered globalization in many ways. A fourth driver of globalization, well, labor availability and skills. Nowadays, companies, they kind of go to wherever they can find the cheapest labor. Yeah? If suddenly China becomes too expensive, they move production to India. If that becomes too expensive, they move it elsewhere. They move it to Bangladesh. And that happens all the time. That's one of the reasons why those big multinational companies have factories all over the world. Or sometimes they don't even have factories anymore. They license that. Yeah? Sometimes there's like these massive companies and they don't employ a single person who produces that good, right? Here I have now a graph about different labor costs for different countries. Now this is our data from 2012. It's a little dated, but the point here is for you to see the difference. Yeah? You see Northern Europe is sort of at the very bottom here, like in the mid-40s. That's sort of what the labor costs are. That includes wages, it includes social security, all these other kind of things. But then look at where India and China are. It's a fraction of that. It's a fraction of that. And that's sort of what comes along with the global market. Yeah? That kind of skill and labor is being drawn from wherever it is. Okay, so these were sort of 4 factors that I wanted to talk to you about, okay, to understand where, I don't know, is this globalization thing coming from, or what does it mean? Now I want to move on, and I talked already about that a little bit. I want to talk to you about pros and cons of globalization. Okay, and before we start that, I want to show you another video, and then I want to ask you, then I have a little activity for you about that video. So this is now actually some news from something that happened this summer. Now there was actually in July. In July there was the G20 meeting in Hamburg. G20, that's sort of like the 20 biggest industrialized nations. They all come together sit around the table and talk about how they can rule the world. And basically this is some news coverage about that.
A Fox News alert, and the protesters are taking to the streets in Hamburg, Germany right now. These pictures just into us, coming in live as protesters there, basically anti-globalization forces, as we understand it, are protesting the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany. Some tear gas is being employed. You can see kind of the anti-personnel armored vehicles there, and there's some of the tear gas that seems to be wafting through the crowds. Obviously, a tense time in Hamburg as the leaders of the top 20 economies of the world have gathered there to talk about the world economic situation and, try to make things better for all of us, but these protesters are having none of it. There go the water cannons, very effective in keeping protesters at bay, knocking them off their feet in a non-lethal way. That's what often happens.
You have to give it to Fox News.
So these, again, the protesters apparently arguing against globalization and throwing rocks and bottles at police officers and so forth. This has been happening, well, for the better part of a decade or so. If you recall what happened when the World Trade Organization came to Seattle, I believe it was. We see this kind of thing time and time again.
Yeah, very often you can see an anarchist strain at some of these protests, and clearly the authorities there were ready for this, as they did anticipate protests and were ready to respond if in fact there were some. So this is no surprise, as John, you mentioned, this happens at other big events. And we'll be following this as it develops.
Supposedly 100,000 protesters. We'll keep an eye on it. Back in just a minute.
As world leaders hold their high-stakes meetings at the G20 summit, thousands of angry protesters have been hitting the streets of Hamburg, Germany.
There was more chaos overnight, and this morning, more protests in the works. ABC's James Longman has been right out there in the thick of it. James, good morning to you.
Dan, Paula, good morning. Another huge night of unrest. But today is meant to be the main day of protest. People bussing in, especially for what they're calling the Solidarity Without Borders. But parts of this city are looking like a war zone.
Overnight, utter chaos on the streets of Hamburg as world leaders prepare for another round of meetings. Protesters setting up blockades, looting and attacking police.
Now it's night time and things have got a lot worse now on the streets. That's water cannon hitting protesters behind us, and they continue to throw things at the police.
Nearly 200 officers injured in clashes, more than 100 detained. Facing a barrage of projectiles thrown from nearby roofs, officers in full riot gear making their way into buildings, arresting those inside. Some 500 people looting this supermarket. During the day, anti-globalization demonstrators marched peacefully, expressing a range of grievances.
I don't think three fascists who have arrived yesterday have the right to be in my city, namely Trump, Putin and Erdogan.
But there is always violence at G20, anarchists railing against a perceived corrupt world order.
We've got the police moving in there, water cannon just deployed, and as the crowds move back, this is basically a big game of cat and mouse.
This morning, President Trump, a target of that criticism, complimenting German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Germany's response to the violence on the street.
It's been really incredible the way things have been handled without much interruption, despite quite a few people. And they seem to follow your G20s around.
We think about 12,000 people are here so far, but more and more are arriving in order to disrupt those G20 meetings. I think we're in for another day of anger. Dan, Paula?
Another day of anger, James. Thank you very much, and be safe out there.
Okay, well, I could go on, but I want to have a little activity with you guys about that. So basically now I want you to, just in small little groups, or maybe just in groups of two, for 2 or 3 minutes, I want you to discuss and think about why are those guys so bloody angry with the G20 and with the WTO. Yeah? Okay, go. Okay, guys, let's stop for this now. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to bring up some pros and cons that are acknowledged by the literature, and then you can see how do you fare with that, or what are other points that you brought up in that regard. So, what does the literature say about that? Well, on the con side, basically, there are no guarantees that the wealth that is being invested in one country, that kind of actually that the community over there benefits from that. And when you look at, for example, huge investments in Angola these days. Angola, apparently the most expensive country in the world. Why? Because there's so many expats there. Why? Because there's a whole lot of bloody oil there. So there's huge investment there, but it doesn't trickle down to the local people. Well, actually, it's the most expensive country in the world, much higher, much more expensive than Dublin, Tokyo, or whatever. But the average wages of the normal people are incredibly, incredibly low. So those investments don't trickle through, they don't go through, and the local community cannot benefit from that. Or some might argue that local companies are being driven out of business. Imagine, well, you can even think about that here in Ireland. I don't know, you used to be an undergarment producer in Ireland. Nowadays, you have no chance anymore, because all the stuff is coming from Bangladesh or India for a fraction of the price. So those companies are being driven out. These transnational companies, they have no problems moving around. Actually, they do that all the time. They're sort of like bloody calculations about how much does it cost, what do I get out from it, how much does the transport cost, and so on. Should I move the factory? And that's sort of what happens all the time. Local people get into it, and then they're being made redundant. Actually, this now starts happening in China. So because now suddenly the labor force dries up. And now suddenly all those people, they have no work employment, they have no contracts whatsoever, they're being sent out on the streets while the factories move over. Actually, one of the new iPhone is partly produced in India because it's slightly cheaper than China nowadays. It can be a threat to the world's cultural diversity. We are overburdened with Hollywood movies and whatnot, and a local culture might disappear from that. Lastly, in the absence of strictly enforced international laws, that's actually often what happens. There are no regulations, there are no labor force regulations in Bangladesh. That's sort of why it's so bloody cheap to produce there. But that's also why you see it on TV, that the factories collapse or that the emergency exits are being blocked to prevent people from moving away, from stealing stuff, from just keeping them in. And then there's a fire, and then hundreds of people die. Or health and safety issues are not being employed. So this is actually from Bangladesh. This is a sweatshop in Bangladesh. And this is sort of how it looks nowadays. Actually, I brought another video. We're running a little bit out of time, but I still want to show it to you because this is actually where my phone comes from. So this is now some secret footage about
This is where your iPhone 6 comes from. These are the first secret pictures from inside the factories that produce for Apple. An exhausted workforce, people sleeping on their breaks, others falling asleep as they work. In 2010, after 14 workers killed themselves at another factory producing iPhones, Apple published promises to protect workers. So have things changed? Our undercover reporters got jobs through agencies, and within minutes Apple's rules were broken. Everyone in China needs to carry an ID card. Our workers' card has been taken.
They said they needed to see my ID. When they got it, they didn't return it to me. I demanded that they return it. I felt helpless.
They came to work at Pegatron, where iPhones and iPads are assembled. They have to pass a crucial health and safety exam. They will. The answers are chanted out. And they're offered a choice whether they want to work nights or do work standing up. But there's no choice.
He said if you don't do what the company asks you to do, what is the point of employing you here?
Apple told us they've seen no evidence of coaching. On ID cards, Apple says they've done more than any company to prevent the widespread abuse of migrant workers. Once in, our reporters were overwhelmed by the workload. Shifts have overtime built in, so workers regularly do more than 60 hours a week, more than Apple's guidelines. And so workers rested when they could. This iPhone 6 testing area has virtually no one awake. Apple says they'll examine sleeping during production, but napping on breaks is not unusual.
Apple has been championing itself as a perfect enterprise, but it is all a facade. I don't think they care about the workers at all.
Pegatron, who run the factory, say they are carefully investigating the BBC's claims and will take all necessary actions. Apple say they work with suppliers to prevent excessive overtime and that no other company is doing as much to ensure fair and safe working conditions. What we found were broken promises on the iPhone factory floor.
Okay, so what is the problem here? There are hardly any regulations on that kind of front. It's not the fact that kind of there's more work or so on. It's about not being regulated in the way that we would have it, let's say, for example, in the European Union and so on. And when you look at the latest rounds of the WTO, these are some of the critical issues. Where sort of like the developed countries actually push towards that. And finally, it's the developed countries that kind of block these kind of tendencies. Okay, so is it all negative? Yeah, well, first of all, it's happening. It's sort of, we're in the right of the middle of it. But maybe there are also opportunities with that. So now these are sort of some arguments on the pro side for globalization. Well, first of all, getting rid of taxes, getting rid of tariffs and things like that reduces barriers between nations. That should facilitate trade. That should also facilitate commerce and the economy. Well, you could argue that kind of investments from these big transnational companies, that it might help to kind of increase the skill level in a country. Yeah. That kind of, now there's education being brought in, there's knowledge being brought in that less developed countries would benefit from. Or you could argue that the extra money that is being produced there could actually be used to bolster education, health, safety, or infrastructure projects. You could say ideas are being shared. People can experience now stuff from all over the world. Technology is transferred. One argument that often falls short, that people don't really think about that, is that actually globalization can actually also help to increase awareness. Nowadays, because we are so connected, we see immediately when something happens in a factory in Bangladesh. It's actually all over the world news, right? So actually, in that sense, globalization makes us aware of disasters or other events happening all over the world. And globalization may also help to increase awareness concerning other issues, such as deforestation or global warming and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I'm running out of time. I'm talking about Ireland. I had some more slides about that. I'm going to put that on Blackboard. You're going to see that. Basically, what I have here is just some fun facts about Ireland, about how much Ireland actually is affected by the trade with the UK and how Brexit will affect that. I had two other challenges that I won't have time to talk about, but I briefly want to flesh it out, and ideally I would love to have whole lectures about that. One is the spread of diseases. Why is that an issue? Well, nowadays we're sort of traveling in ways that we've never done it before. People actually, experts say in the next 20, 30 years, there is going to be a massive pandemic happening. And I'm not kind of like painting the devil here at the wall, I don't know, I'm very much an optimist. But these things happen. Just remember, we had bird flu a few years ago, we had Ebola last year, and even though it was just a tiny little, small number of people, suddenly the world was all over it. Why? Because we travel like crazy. So our travel patterns sort of affect that. So we are very, very vulnerable to that. Another aspect that briefly I just want to mention, that comes out of that, and you saw the little video about the container ships, it's climate change. Climate change, because all this shipping around produces a massive carbon footprint. Yeah. All those companies in the world that are being produced in China with less environmental regulations than we would have over here, because it's cheaper, yeah? And that is why it's being produced over there, has a massive impact on climate change. And here I have one slide, and with that one I want to finish. There you actually see, again, sort of like the green line is the international trade, how it increased from the 1990s. That's basically more or less the same data. But there you see another line, which is the global fossil emissions and the emissions embodied in trade, and you see how these increase with it as well. Right? So this is sort of like two massive challenges that I would love to talk more with you about, but I don't have the time, so this is sort of the overview on globalization. You're going to get the slides on Blackboard. I'm going to put the video on Blackboard as well. It's great seeing you. Have fun.